If you haven't listened to the first 3 stories in this audiobook series, I'll leave the links below in order. Also, if you want to support me so I can keep doing this, I have a Ko-Fi page you can visit that has a few extra goodies. And if you enjoy my stories, my website features all of my printed novels and ebooks. The links on there will take you to Amazon. Once she fell back onto her futon, she never wanted to get up again. Sinking deeper into the thick material, the groan she expelled followed her all the way down. With her arms spread out to the sides, her feet dangling off the edge, just that little bit of a lack of support made her realize she had missed her mark, but by only a little. Yet, it didn't matter, because she was committed now. Next time she got up, it would be 5 years later. "Finally reach your limit, huh?" her host asked. Bekka was forced to concentrate on her own breathing, but because her host's voice was right there in her head, there was no escaping it. So she couldn't help but notice the lack of labored breathing on that end. Finding a moment in the measured rises and falls of her chest, she responded, "I still don't see why we gotta go at this so hard. I mean, the whole idea is to pass the message along. This match is just in case we have to." "Yeah," her host said, "which is very likely. You know that." Bekka laid her left forearm across her eyes, still so focused on her breathing, knowing at some point it would start to slow down. Relishing the darkness behind her eyelids, she spared some of what was left of her mental faculties to go over the details of the plan. Instead of sinking further into the futon, she felt herself shrink inward when she considered her host's words. With what little effort she could muster, she replied, "So she'll really forfeit? I mean, it won't take that long to convince her?" "You know," her host began, "I thought your endurance was much better than that." Bekka threw her arm off her face, but kept her eyes closed as she whined, "Running is different from beating people up." "I jog in the mornings," her host countered. "Then I practice." Already feeling her breathing slowing, Bekka said, "Yeah, but you're a trained ninja." Her host snickered. Then she said nothing, leaving Bekka to listen to her own breathing. Her pace was still slowing, each intake not as deep as the last. When her harsh wheezing no longer drummed in her ears, her host spoke again. "She's not in it to win, just like we aren't." Bekka opened her eyes a little. Before she responded, she replayed her host's statement again, looking for something in the tone. Then she asked, "You sure about that?" "What?" her host questioned. "You don't want to win anymore?" Bekka clarified. Her host scoffed. "No, not this one. It was never real anyway." Bekka grinned. "And as soon as we get the news to her host continued, "she'll feel the same way." Bekka barked a struggling laugh. "Won't the crowd be disappointed?" "Yeah, well," her host responded, "until the next match begins. As long as they're entertained." Bekka opened her eyes further. "Right." "And then," her host added, "you'll get paid and we'll go our separate ways." Bekka grunted. "Another job done." Her grin vanished when she added, "Are you gonna celebrate afterward? I figured, with you guys, it's just on to the next thing." "Oh, I'm gonna celebrate," her host said. "Oh yeah?" Bekka asked. "Definitely," her host said. "But they won't even know it was you who did it," Bekka said. "Doesn't matter," her host replied. "I'll know, and the consequences will be the same regardless." Bekka sighed. "Losing a sure thing. Yeah, they'll be heartbroken." "As if scum like them even deserve anything good to happen to them," her host chuckled. "Besides, they'll just move on to their next dirty plan. I'm pretty sure they're used to losing a lot. People like that, the company they keep." What a way to live, Bekka muttered. Maybe it won't be that big of a loss for them, her host said, but what I'll get out of this, well, I gotcha, Bekka said. Yeah, her host changed her tone. So, anyway, you remember the time tomorrow, right? You're leaving, huh? Bekka asked. Not for my sake, her host snickered, but for yours. You need to rest. Haven't even broken a sweat, I bet, Bekka snorted. Sitting here like this, her host answered, and I don't even feel guilty about it. Ha, Bekka retorted. Then she relaxed her body further. We'll connect again tomorrow. Right, her host said. Until then. Bekka always felt the exact moment the connection was severed. Her body emptied out of that extra something, and she was able to shrink into the cavity that was left, taking on her original shape, she always thought. Now she waited for the call from her boss. The beep in her head sounded, and she saw the notification appear in her vision. Flexing the corresponding muscle, the call was answered. She decided to let Alicia speak first. Heh, I'd ask if everything was cool, but... Ha ha, Bekka groaned, staring up at the ceiling. Well, her boss continued, it's not like we have much to discuss anyway. I'm really only contacting you because someone's trying to reach you. Bekka sobered. Is it? I told him he had to wait, Alicia began, because you were still witnessing your host. Bekka grinned. You totally made him wait? As worn out as you are now, Alicia responded, you think you could handle the distraction? He would have behaved, Bekka said. Yeah, well, I'm patching him through, Alicia said. As soon as your conversation with him ends, I'll cut my connection too. Gotcha, Bekka responded. All right, Alicia said. Talk to you tomorrow then. Right, bye, Bekka said. Bye, but I just got in touch with you. A familiar voice came through. Bekka raised up and supported herself as she reclined. Looking down at her attire, the sweaty athletic spats and sports tank top felt different now. Grinning, she said, Psh, whatever. I was telling my boss bye. Alex chuckled in her head. Her grin widened. I figured I'd make this quick, he began, and she interrupted him. How come? Well, he started again. Figured you'd want to wash up after your workout and all, so... He was only connected to her through the agency's channel. It wasn't the same as with her hosts, so there wouldn't have been the possibility he could have even sensed the thoughts she was entertaining right then. She was wondering if he had tried to picture her in his mind as soon as he mentioned the idea of her taking a shower. Then again, it was him she was talking to. It was quite possible that, despite going through the official channel, he had snuck some kind of file through, secretly attaching something to her implants without the agency knowing. Oh, well, she began. It might take me a few minutes before I can drag myself off the bed. He chuckled. I gotcha. Well, while you're conscious, I wanted to ask a favor. What's that? She asked. First, he began, you gotta promise not to get mad. Her grin stretched into a full smile. Get mad at what? I, can't tell you yet, he answered. She snickered. You gotta promise me first, he finished. Tilting her head to the side in consideration, she then said, Mysterious. Actually, he added, I figured you might think it's kind of cool. Oh yeah? She asked, tilting her head to the other side. So like, he began, you know how these matches tend to have, shall we say, a bit of style to them, right? Bekka closed her eyes and wrinkled her brow. So I hear. Alex chuckled. Well, I placed a bet. Opening her eyes, she wore a wry smile and said, You did. I wouldn't have, he continued, but then I got an idea. Uh-oh, Bekka replied. Heh, couldn't resist, he said, his voice trailing off. So, she prompted him, what is it you need me to do? He didn't answer outright, and she was wondering if he was actually hesitating. She waited, though. Feeling it in her toes, she wanted to know what this favor was. "For tomorrow's match," he finally answered, "will you wear something special for me?" The wave of heat rushed from the top of her head all the way down to the soles of her feet. He waited for her answer. Now it was her turn to drag things out. She lied back on her futon and stretched her arms above her head. Smiling up at the ceiling, she asked, "What is it you want me to wear?" "Actually," he began, and she thought she heard his voice crack, but she could have been mistaken. "It should be arriving at your place pretty soon." Arching an eyebrow, she asked, "Really?" "Yeah," he answered. "I went ahead and sent it over." Bekka snickered. "Pretty confident, aren't you?" "Heh, well, your boss okayed it," he offered. "Told me about the extra something I was supposed to include in it." With her arms still lying above her head, she closed her eyes and laughed. "What, is it fitted with armor plating or something?" "Not that," he said, snickering under his breath, "but it's laced with an array of sensors." "Oh yeah," Bekka said. "My host told us about those. All the fighters have to have them to register." "Yeah," he said, "but they also have a lot to do with the bet I made." "A bet with who, by the way?" she asked. "Or is that something I'm not supposed to know?" You won't know who it is," he offered. "Just someone who frequents the fights." "And you don't?" she asked. "I've known about them," he answered, "but this is my first time actually participating in one. Well, vicariously, anyway." "So you won't be there in person," she said. "Oh, I'll be there," he said, and her smile returned. "I'll have to be, since I'm placing a bet." Relieved, she then asked, "And this bet entails?" "Yeah, so," he began, "the guy I made the bet with, you probably won't believe me, but the dude's a total freak about the outfits the fighters wear. Oh, and it's not what you think. I mean, he's really into the styles. You should have been there. During our conversation, he totally showed me his catalog. The guy has an actual catalog of all the fighters he's watched. But it's not about the fighters and their stats. It's focused on their outfits." "Seriously?" Bekka snickered. "You'd probably be surprised at how deep the counterculture goes in these underground fights," Alex chuckled. "These fans get into the stats of the fighters, their outfits, how many times two fighters have fought against one another, even how much money has been bet on each fighter, and not just whether they would win or lose. Kind of like the bet I made with this guy." "I'm still wondering what that bet is," Bekka said. "Oh, right," he said. "So, he's trying to complete his catalog of outfits." "Okay," Bekka snickered. "Yeah," he continued. "So, he's got some color-coded thing going on. He said he's seen the girl you're gonna fight tomorrow in just about all of her outfits, except for her new one." "Okay," Bekka said. "So now he's making a spot in his catalog for her new outfit," he explained. "But the sport of it all is that he's placed bets with fans with similar interests as to who she's going to fight against next. Well, it sort of matters who her opponent is going to be, but remember, these guys are, eccentric?" "Okay," Bekka said. "He's mostly interested in what the outfit of her opponent is going to be," he continued. "And while the fans he's placed bets with have compiled their notes and placed bets on who it's going to be—" "You placed a bet that it's going to be the new girl," Bekka said. "Not just that," he answered. "The outfit, right?" she asked. "Well, he's decided to make it more fun," he continued. "You see, he agreed on the bet that the new girl would fight her." "But," Bekka offered. "But," he said he'd double the bet if the new girl wore an outfit of a certain color." "Are you serious?" Bekka snorted. "Absolutely," Alex chuckled. "These guys are all about this stuff." "So," she began, "he bet against you at all because—" "He doesn't think you'll be matched up with her, for one thing," he answered. "No?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. seeing as she's in a different tier and all. He considers this a high-stakes bet, so he couldn't help himself. Cross-tier matches have surprised the fans in the past, so... "Won't this guy figure out that you had some inside info?" she asked. "That's part of the game," he offered. "Actually, from what I've learned, that's how most bets are made with these matches. There's no official set of bets. It's all up to the two people betting as to what the bet is." "Ha, yeah, what could go wrong there?" Bekka responded. "Oh, well, I may have phrased that a little wrong," he said. "You see, there's no worry about someone not forking over the money if they lose. The bets are made between whoever, but they bring it to the ringmaster." Bekka snorted. "Ringmaster." "The bet is clearly laid out," Alex continued, "and he takes the money. Once the match is over or whatever, he's the one who divvies out the cash to the winner." "Heh, you know," Bekka began, "the real objective to my mission is to convince her to quit the fights altogether. We could totally meet without being in an actual match." "Yeah," he said, "and all you have to do is shake her hand and the info gets transferred." She blinked, paused, and then said, "Oh yeah, the sensors. Wait, for real? I thought..." Yeah," he began. "Forgot about that part. The heart of all of this silliness is the connection you make with her." "Oh yeah?" Bekka questioned. He heard the sardonic tone in her voice. "Yeah, just like these particular fans, the ringmaster has the official catalog, right?" "Sure," Bekka snickered. "Right, anyway," he continued, "the catalogs are all digital, of course, which means data has to be keyed in to log as an entry. Fans don't just get to witness the fights with their own eyes. Whenever they hand over their creds to the ringmaster, whether they win or lose, when they get their cards back, the transfer or loss of creds leaves a file on there. They plug their cards into their catalogs, making their entries legit." "Heh," Bekka snickered. "Legit to who?" "Why, the fans, of course," Alex offered. "Uh-huh," Bekka replied. "Oh, don't worry," he said. "I haven't joined their weird little cult or whatever." Bekka snickered again. "Are you sure about that?" Chuckling at her question, he then explained, "I just had to learn all of this so I could place my bet. So, going back to the whole sensors thing, what matters is that the two fighters have met. And, well, in a match, physical connection is guaranteed. The sensors in your outfit are what actually get registered to the ringmaster's database. Yours come in contact with the sensors in her outfit, and that's all that's needed." "Really?" she said. "Yep," he said, "and since I know you have to make contact with her, well..." "You win your bet," she said. "Yep," he stated. "Won't they believe you faked it?" she asked. "Like, hacked the database or something and transferred the file you needed, or..." "You can't," he reassured her. "Not with this, trust me." She playfully mocked him. "I wonder." "Heh, well," he began, "one of the things you pick up on when hanging around people like that is that cheating is definitely not a thing." "It's not, huh?" she asked. "Nope," he answered. "Apparently, the consequences are pretty severe, and they always seem to find out." Bekka rolled onto her side and huffed. "Yeah, from everything my host has told me, these fights are very well organized." "Yeah," he said, "and the fans enjoy keeping all aspects of them going. So some loser who thinks he can cheat takes the fun away in their eyes." Bekka grinned, her thoughts going in another direction. "It's like what happened that last time." "Last time?" he asked. "Yeah," she answered, and propped herself up with her elbow. "You plundering to get info, and Alicia tells you some stuff too." "Heh, well, like that last time, she offered that info," he reminded her. "Only this time," Bekka added, "you're not an official part of the mission." "Maybe it was because I was getting involved anyway," he said. "So she didn't think it would hurt. Plus, I'm a previous client." Bekka wrinkled her nose. "We don't exactly keep close ties with our past clients." "Huh," he responded. "Maybe she thinks I'm trustworthy or something." "Or Bekka offered. She likes you. He was silent. She waited to see what he would say. She had been smiling when she made her loaded joke, but the longer he was silent, the further her expression shrank. She was once more relieved when he finally spoke. Heh, my luck, she could be keeping an eye on me because of what I know. Pleased with his response, she offered, Better watch out. She might try to scout you. Well, he offered back. She'll be disappointed. I'm a contract worker. I like my freedom. The rogue, she muttered. Yeah, he said. Guess you could say that, but I at least have some honor. Is that right? She teased. Yeah, he answered, because I'm totally gonna split the winnings with you after this. What? She said, actually surprised. It's only right, he added, seeing as you're helping me win. She grinned, and apparently still playing by the ringmaster's rules. A notification appeared in her vision, pulling her from the conversation. At first, she didn't register it, but then she remembered what Alex had said at the beginning of all of this. Wow. What's up? He asked. You weren't lying, she said, and instantly remembered saying that to him before. Wasn't it when they were on that monorail? I'm about to receive my package. The delivery guy is coming up the stairs now. Heh, talk about surveillance, he chuckled. Anyway, I'll let you go so you can check it out. Rising up from her futon and sliding further to place her feet on the floor, she asked, Wait, you don't want to be here when I try it on? She paused when she realized how that had sounded. Well, since I already know what it looks like, he responded, as she stepped across her bedroom for the hallway. I'll just wait until tomorrow to see how it fits. Entering her quaint living room, she approached her front door and waited. Crossing her arms, she said, Sounds like you're trying to make a getaway. You think you're gonna get in trouble with me, don't you? He chuckled. What makes you say that? You haven't even seen the outfit yet. Wrinkling her brow, she asked, So, you're saying it's not bikini armor? Heh, I promise there's no armor, he offered. She caught what he said. But it is a bikini. I didn't say that, he snickered. She grumbled. He snickered again. Tomorrow. Just wait until tomorrow. Then you can show me how you feel about it. She wondered again if his connection to her implants was deeper than the agency knew. Would he find out that she was blushing right then? Troublemaker, she muttered. He chuckled. Connect again tomorrow. The label in her vision showing the channel with him blinked off. Only seconds later, the post compartment built into the wall next to her front door received the package. So, her host began, he isn't your boyfriend? Slipping the glove over her fingers to rest around the back of her hand and inside her palm, Bekka responded, Why do you ask? Whatever, girl, her host retorted, because you're totally wearing it. Turning to face the tall mirror standing in the corner, Bekka looked at herself and smirked. I know, right? So, her host urged, is he or not? What's wrong? Bekka asked, lifting the bottom of the hem of her skirt just a little. Don't you guys wear stuff like this in the fights? He isn't your boyfriend, her host grumbled. Releasing the hem, she twisted her hips one way and then the other, examining herself. No, he's not. Well then, he totally wants to be, her host snickered. Either that, or he's a total creeper. Bekka grinned, remembering what one of her previous hosts said about him. Something like being an awkward recluse, wasn't it? I mean, come on, her host continued. Look at that top. Bekka thought her host would mention the skirt first, yet she reached up to take the straps running from either side of the front section between her index fingers and thumbs. Examining the piece, she asked, What's wrong with it? Exactly, her host gasped. It fits perfectly. He totally knows your cup size. Bekka had considered this long before she put the top on. When she first pulled it out of the package, that was one of the many things that ran through her mind. Trying it on in her bedroom, she had a sneaking suspicion it would fit, and when it did, she knew what had happened. Actually, she began to explain, I'm pretty sure I have my boss to blame for that. Your boss? Her host asked. She told him? Like, your measurements? Well, Bekka answered, the task for getting my outfit was up to her anyway. Her host snorted. She and that guy totally conspired behind your back. Normally, Bekka continued, still examining herself in the mirror, I wouldn't wear anything like this. You don't seriously believe I'm going to buy that you're wearing this solely for that bet? Her host scoffed. Why not? Bekka asked, but she knew where her host was coming from, sort of. The top was basically a bra with lacy frills lining the bottom of the front. With the main strap that crossed along her back, there were also 2 shoulder straps. She wore a choker in similar style and material that had extra ribbon-like extensions she tied in a bow in the back. The excess length hung down between her shoulder blades. The skirt was nothing more than layered frills, very obviously not long enough to hide the lower half of her panties. Yet, along with the rest of the outfit, they were black. The only part that wasn't was an extra piece of thin lace attached to the top of the skirt that hugged her hips. It only added about a ½ inch, not even close to reaching her belly button. The material was white, but in the back, attached to the top edge, was a little black bow. Yeah, she knew she was basically wearing lingerie. Her host knew it too, despite telling her ahead of time what type of atmosphere to expect in the arena. She could hear it from here. Standing alone in this employee lounge, there was no other noise to drown out the muffled roar of the crowds and the echoing voice of the commentator. This wasn't the only area where fighters waited and readied themselves, though. She had hoped to run into her target fighter already, but the bouncers directed her here because of the tier she was assigned to. The only light available was a portable LED stick sitting on the little table at her left. The other nooks and crannies and compartments of this makeshift backstage area was left in darkness. Although she could smell the sweat from the discarded clothes on the floor or soaked into the worn-out couches sitting against the walls. The girls had left their outfits on purpose. Whether they came back from their fights looking all proud or with their heads hanging, there were the auctions at the end of the night. Once bets were settled and catalogs were updated, the die-hard fans used their winnings to try and take at least one of those outfits home. The girls who wore them got a percentage of the earnings, so even if some of them lost their match, they didn't leave empty-handed. Something else is going on, her host muttered. You can't fool me. Not to change the subject, Bekka said, but will those 2 bouncer dudes in the hallway let me walk around backstage? Her host grunted. No, looks like I left an impression. They're not taking any chances now. Bekka sighed. So, we're gonna fight then. It's just a formality in the end, her host stated. You're hoping she caught on to you, Bekka offered. I know she at least heard the rumors, her host said. And she'll act on them, Bekka added. She'll pick up on something, her host said. We'll use that to our advantage. Heh, in other words, Bekka began, breaking the ice won't be so hard. It'll be a relief for her, if anything, her host said. Yeah, Bekka responded. I imagine an undercover agent discovering a fellow agent on the same mission is a bit comforting. Well, that, her host said, and that she doesn't have to stay on the mission anymore. I thought she'd be disappointed, Bekka said. I mean, she wasn't the one who got the criminal, and it wasn't even your part of your mission, but... Believe it or not, her host said, but getting to slip away in one piece is always the bigger win in this line of work. Bekka grinned. And that's what this mission is about. Her host sighed. How would you feel if the mission you were assigned to had been completed for days or even weeks before you found out? Bekka's grin fell away. I know it's not the same for me. The nature of my job is kind of me going undercover, but most of the time, I'm just skimming the surface of some iceberg. But I imagine having to wake up in the mornings on the razor's edge and having to straddle it all day, maybe not even getting a night's rest, only to find out you didn't have to. After a moment, her host spoke. Yeah, and that's not taking into consideration the possible dangerous ways you'd find out. They were both silent then. The rumble of the arena washed over everything, vibrating the walls, the floor under her shoes. She'd have to take them off before she entered the ring, but she was grateful the bouncers let her wear them until then. There was no telling what was in the raggedy carpet stretching the length of the hallway. Even here in this lounge, who knew the amount of times couples or groups snuck back here for after parties, or during the fights to have a bit of fun. Bekka eventually spoke up. If I was to find out, I'd want a friend to be the one to tell me. A loud knock sounded at the door. Believe me, her host responded as she stepped away from the LED light and into the gloom. She'll be grateful for every credit I paid for this job. The knocks sounded again just before she twisted the door handle. Pulling the door open, the giant bouncer was standing there with his meaty hand still raised. With the burst of sound that cut around his sides and over his shoulders entering the room, her initial reaction was to squint against a rushing wind. The guy must have noticed this because he smirked down at her. As big as he wasn't enough of a stopgap against the noise, and from his expression, he didn't want to be. Lowering his arm, he took in a long, deep breath, lifting his nose as he did. Bekka was trying to figure out whether he was showing off or being a pervert and relishing the aromas slipping from the room and out into the hallway. When he expelled his breath, he opened his mouth and let out a loud sigh. He ended it by saying in a satisfied growl, "It's time." Don't worry, her host scoffed. He did that the first time he escorted me. Bekka wore a wry grin. The arena was on the other side of the wall at her left. The noise of the crowds had her reevaluating what her host told her of this building's layout. What she was essentially walking toward was a ballroom on the second floor of this downtown multi-purpose center. Long since abandoned by the previous owners and considered condemned by the public, but that was just to keep everyone away. Most of the infrastructure was still intact, though Bekka assumed maintenance wasn't a top priority here. What random bits of articles that were strewn about the floors, the layers of graffiti mapping out nonsense on the walls, the missing tiles from the ceiling, and the smell of body odor mixed with free-based aromas were records of nights past. More notches on the belt of the counterculture thriving in this grimy corner of the city. And as it took another hit from its vices, the walls thinned, the ceilings bowed, and the floors warped, allowing the cheers from the masses to seep through those porous barriers and soak the very air. Knowing the arena's location, she thought she was hearing the voices coming at her from everywhere, like there was a whole other event taking place in the floors above. Some celebration might have been testing the foundation of the building beneath her, and perhaps she was being led in the wrong direction because she could have sworn a crowd was cheering from some auditorium in the opposite direction. The bouncer escorting her had been marinated by this spirit so long ago that she figured he was merely swimming outside of his own brain at the moment. The hallway trembled under the reverberations of his voice. I got another poor soul here. Won't somebody help a lost soul find the light? Spreading his arms, taking up even more space in the hallway, and casting Bekka under a darker shadow, he twisted his body to either side, as if pleading with the voices of the crowds surrounding them both. "Gather round, got another poor soul here." Then he laughed, a great hearty laugh, sucked in another breath, and sang some more. "Won't you please save a poor soul? Have pity on a poor soul." He threw his head back and tortured the brittle ceiling tiles with his laughter. "Not nervous, are you?" her host asked. Having given up trying to see anything past the big gorilla in front of her, Bekka's thoughts had carried her somewhere else. Responding to her host's question, she replied with, "I wonder how he's gonna get in touch with me." "Who?" her host asked, and then added after quick consideration, "Your boyfriend?" "He never even mentioned that to me," Bekka added. "There's no way he'll be able to sneak past the security they got set up now," her host said. "If even the fighters are on lockdown, what were you expecting?" "Something that came with the outfit?" Bekka wondered. She squinted when she remembered. "But I checked the package. There wasn't anything else." Her eyes widened to a thought. The sensors. The bouncer's thunderous laughter shook the ceiling again. "Ain't no turning back now, girlie. This the final stretch. You're committed. Ha ha ha!" "Wait, yeah," Bekka said. "Am I supposed to turn them on, or?" "Pretty sure your boss got that taken care of," her host replied. "Does it work that way?" Bekka muttered. "It works," her host insisted. "Don't worry about it." Still gazing through the singing gorilla's wall of a back, Bekka muttered, "I might mess it up." Her host began. "You're not going into shock all of a sudden, are you?" Bekka's eyes brightened. "Oh, maybe that's it. As soon as I make contact." "Honey, you're not even with it right now," her host said. "Might as well let me go ahead and take over, huh?" "But how will I hear his voice?" Bekka wondered. "You still hear me, right?" her host questioned. The bouncer stepped to the right, unveiling a light ahead that pierced the gloom. With it came a stream of mounting voices. "We're here," her host stated. Ahead, the bouncer was standing next to the wall, but he was facing her. Sweeping both arms around in front of him, he went into a bow as his hands aimed toward the light source several feet away. "You got it the rest of the way, right, little miss?" he chuckled. Bekka's drone-like pace didn't falter, yet she wasn't aware of the great big smile plastered on the bouncer's face as she passed in front of him. When she entered the light, he called out from behind her, "Have fun out there, ha ha!" She was drawn toward the light, but there was only a portion offered to her. Standing just on the other side of the threshold were two silhouettes. Both were men of almost the same height, their shoulders narrow compared to the bouncer's, but because they were standing next to one another, facing her way, they were blocking access to the arena. They were only a footnote in the present situation, because Bekka was running her thoughts over the layout of her outfit. Reaching up to touch the side of the choker around her neck, she wondered aloud, what if there is a button? "Too late for that now, girl," her host said. "We're here." The lights beyond the two men were moving somehow. Maybe they were sparkles. Then again, they used spotlights in events like these, didn't they? That could have been it. But wait, all of those voices, so many compacted into one spot, couldn't that have an effect on them? Like heat waves distorting the ground. That could have been it. All that shouting, that hot air trapped in. "I know what y'all are thinking." A voice louder than the bouncer's broke through every sound. "Y'all thinking it's time. Time for the final." The commentator held out the end of the word, and the crowd erupted. The longer he stretched the word, the more everyone raised their voices. trying to match his intensity. When he either started to lose his breath or he thought he had riled the crowd up enough, he finished the word and continued his announcement. All match! Ain't that right? There was no room for a break in the noise. The rumbles that accompanied their voices were their feet stomping the floor, their fists pounding the walls. Ain't even gonna make you wait for it, the commentator shouted. Y'all know who I'm gonna announce anyway. Ain't seen her yet, but don't you think you gonna get away this night? No, not this night, without the Queen of the Ring. They lifted their voices again, choking out the airspace that the commentator's voice once occupied. To Bekka's left, the bouncer leaned down to place his face level with the top of her head. With his arms crossed, he said, Didn't even know that, did you? Lucky you. Got paired up with some top-shelf octane. Way to get broke in. Let me bring it out, the commentator called. We tired of waiting, ain't we? Come on. Again, the crowds threatened the integrity of the building with their voices. Meanwhile, Bekka was touching places along the choker while muttering to herself. Gotta be in there. Gotta be somewhere. Psh, her host grunted. Glad it's me and not you, baby doll. When Bekka didn't respond, she added, You remember that, right? I don't want you tripping over yourself when I take over now. The commentator carried on. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna tell you right now. Who's stepping out in the ring, yo? Oh, it ain't nobody but Royal Cannonbomb. If the integrity of the building was tested before, then the crowds were trying to tear the walls down now. The rush of sound that escaped the arena and struck Bekka made her blink. Pausing her musings, she stared into the light, chiseling out the silhouettes of the two men before her. Gazing straight into that wave of sound, her vision began to blur. She didn't reach up to check if her eyes were watering. She just kept staring, thinking it was the sound causing vibrations in the light. That's her. That was her host's voice. Bekka worked to try and focus just beyond the two men, but she could see nothing but more blurred light. Her target was out there. She didn't even know what the girl looked like. It wasn't like the announcement filled her with awe. Put away the audience, the commentator, the bouncer dude, and the thugs that forced her host to hide herself. All that was left was her target. That, and somewhere mixed in with the masses, was Alex. Somewhere. How would she know where to look for him? Her outfit was the key. Reaching up to touch her choker again, she started to feel for some indication of a hidden button. You may ask yourselves, the commentator started again, who would dare challenge the Lady Cannon before us? Who would dare? Is it another who has risen up through the ranks? Is it one who has surpassed all odds and now stands upon the corpses of the defeated for this one chance? I mean, come on. Lady Cannon, she ain't gonna be satisfied unless the fight is worth it, am I right? The bouncer's chuckle rumbled next to Bekka. Gee, I wonder who it's gonna be. Are we gonna pit Titan against Titan to end the night? The commentator asked. Then he laughed and told the crowd, No, that ain't how we do things here, y'all know that. We done fixed it up. All you punks pay your respects, you hear me? To the meat we tossin' into the ring tonight. Heh, the bouncer chuckled. Wonder if it's even seasoned right. Her first fight, the commentator called. Her first taste of the ring. Yeah, we got a newcomer, y'all. But don't y'all go feeling sorry for her. Ain't like nobody twisted her arm to be here. But here she be. Welcome her to the ring, y'all. Wee little Miss Tilly might tear up some folks. Come on. Bekka stopped her fingers along her choker. While the crowd roared, she muttered, Wait, that's not my name. Did your boss leave a typo in your documents? Her host asked. Bekka mused. She might have been distracted. Like you are right now? Her host scoffed. She probably does have a thing for him, Bekka muttered to herself. Girl, just let me take over already, her host snapped. Bekka blinked. Oh yeah. She let her arms rest at her sides. Go ahead. Her host said nothing, but the feeling solidified in Bekka's body. It was no longer her own. The strength she felt then wasn't about muscle mass. Her host changed her whole stance. From the upright posture, head tilted to the right, she shrank to a slight hunch, head leveled. The blank look on her face was replaced with a sharp glint. A smirk touched her lips. She brought her hands up and slammed the knuckles of her left hand into the palm of her right. The two men who had been standing in the way had stepped toward her and then moved to either side. Slipping out of her shoes, she stalked through the doorway, paying the men no mind. Behind her, the bouncer chuckled. Heh, I was beginning to wonder. Bekka thought she had stepped into the spin cycle of a washing machine. The voices splashed upon her, crashed over her head, and submerged her feet into thick currents that pushed in the opposite direction she was going. They were there to either side of her, faces stretched and exaggerated, masks that expelled sounds from the strange smiles cut into their surfaces. If they had eyes, did they see her? Or were they blinded by the excitement? Now they just fed off of it. There was nothing else to do but roar, and so they did. Yet, they didn't obstruct her way. In fact, when her host happened to glance down, she saw the red carpet under her feet. It led the way through the hordes, exposing some larger space just ahead. Glancing upward, there was darkness, but spotlights cast their glow down to coat the crowds in yellows and reds and whites, pointing out those who were jumping up and down, pumping their fists into the air. Their sound never stopped. It further clothed her, preparing her for what waited at the end of the path. In her muddled thoughts, there was space for her to know. Right then, she understood them. Having never invested anything in this place or this corner of the city, she at least understood why they cheered. Even if her host had control now, she might have let herself get carried away in the turbulent currents brushing against her. But then she spotted a rock in the flow. Something still and peaceful, contrasting against everything around it. The person was standing along the right edge of the red carpet. Their head was covered, because whenever one of the spotlights passed over, they remained in shadow. About to walk by, she saw this person was wearing a hoodie, and like everyone else, their focus was on her. Whether her host had loosened a little bit of control or not, she was able to turn her head and stay locked on the dark space underneath that person's hood. Right as she was passing in front of them, she heard their voice. They didn't raise it to compete with all the surrounding cheer, but they didn't have to. It reached her, and it sounded familiar. I'm betting on the underdog. Then she was nearing the end of the red carpet, and her host took control, turning her focus ahead. The opened space greeted her, and she stepped forth into the eye of a hurricane. So, her host said with her mouth, that was your man, huh? Bekka didn't answer. While her host was studying what was in front of her, she was able to consider what was behind. That had been him, right? He didn't reach out for her, to make contact with her outfit, to trigger something. She expected him to, but because he didn't, was she missing something? What was she missing? Or was he not going to connect with her like before? Heh, her host began. Check her out. Bekka was pulled back through her own eyes to look ahead. Several yards away, her opponent stood, her target. Unmoving, draped in the avalanche of cheers behind her, Lady Cannon ignored it all. Her posture had most of her weight on her right leg. Her hand was resting on that hip. Her other arm was resting down at her side. With the whole theme of flair and style being a thing here, Bekka thought she looked more the regular kickboxer, a bright orange sports bra and matching boxer shorts, which contrasted against her dark skin. Perhaps it was her hair, Bekka thought. She wore dreads, but they were flipped over to the left, revealing the shaved part of her head on the right. The longer dreads almost reached down to touch her left shoulder, but to keep them all from flopping about during the fight, she was wearing some type of hairnet. It only stretched over the middle of her head, attaching to a thin band going across her brow and on around to the back. Bekka could see it because it was glowing a bright yellow. Despite the crowd going wild, Lady Cannon's expression was calm. Though her brow was slightly creased, her eyes never once strayed from Bekka's. "Heh, ain't gonna lie," her host muttered. "I might feel like cutting up a little." Before Bekka could reply, the commentator broke through the noise. "Alright, come on now. We ain't got all night. Quit cutting eyes and get to slugging. Ayo!" The crowd cried, churning the walls of the Hurricane's eye. Bekka felt it, saw the blur of the lights, saw Lady Cannon strolling toward her. Her host huffed. Well, here we go. She stalked forward in the same fashion she traversed the red carpet, slightly hunched, her shoulders rocking back and forth with each step. "Oh yeah," the commentator squealed. "Get it?" Bekka thought she actually stepped outside of herself then. Her vision moved like hard rain. She couldn't exactly tell which way she was going, but the crowd saw it. Both Bekka and Lady Cannon threw a right jab just as they met. The edges of their left knuckles ricocheted off each other. Their fists jarred from their trajectory. They kept going forward, sliding along the inside of the other fighter's forearm. Bekka dipped her head to the left, dodging Lady Cannon's fist. Everything froze at that moment, and then she flexed her right arm, curling it around Lady Cannon's. Both fighters worked their feet, stepping around the others as Bekka drew Lady Cannon into her. Before their hips crashed into each other, Bekka sent her left fist down and across her own belly. Reaching between both bodies, she ended up snagging Lady Cannon's left wrist. It was closing in for a kidney shot. Now, Bekka curled her right leg around Lady Cannon's, and both fighters were locked together. "You won't recognize me," Bekka grunted, "but I know you." Lady Cannon tried to break free of her hold. "No surprise," Bekka grunted again. "And you know me." Lady Cannon scoffed a laugh. "That right." She jerked her left arm back, slipping free of Bekka's grasp. Then she went for Bekka's head. In one move, Bekka uncurled her arm from Lady Cannon's and caused the fighter to twist to the right. Backing away, Bekka pulled her right leg from around Lady Cannon's, and then used her left hand to shove her right shoulder, further twisting her opponent in that direction. The distance grew between them. As Bekka stepped backward, she left her hands down at her sides. Lady Cannon twisted around, quickening her forced turn, and faced Bekka once more. Regarding her opponent as she strafed to her right, her brow wrinkled before she put her fist back up in ready position. "You know that move, don't you?" Bekka called. Then she stalked forward. Lady Cannon rushed her, throwing a right hook, but stopped it midway to throw her left fist forward. Bekka reached up to catch the first feint, and then slapped the other away. Suddenly open, Lady Cannon watched for the counterattack, but nothing came. Seizing the moment, she brought her guard back up and closed the distance, throwing her right knee toward her opponent. Bekka used both hands to shove Lady Cannon's knee back down. Forced to take that step forward, Lady Cannon used it to throw her right fist at Bekka's face. Bekka tilted her head to the right, feeling her opponent's fist next to her ear. Then she reached up, snagging Lady Cannon's arm just as she started to retract it. Wrapping both their arms together, Bekka tugged her opponent close. Lady Cannon came with her left fist, but Bekka slapped it away again and then gripped the back of her opponent's neck. Pulling Lady Cannon into a forced hug, before Lady Cannon started to fire off her knees again, Bekka shouted in her ear, "Stella, it's me, Maya. it's me. Y'all trying to make friends out there or what? The commentator laughed. Lady Cannon gasped at the mentioning of her name, her real name. Bekka felt the muscles of her own arms go slack. Her host, Maya, had done this. With the grip given up, Lady Cannon, Stella, noticed it and swept her right arm free. Then she brought her right knee up for Bekka's stomach. Maya took over again, using Bekka's left hand to push down on Stella's knee. When Stella's foot touched the floor again, she used the motion to hop backward. There was maybe a half a second where Bekka could have struck her, but no attack came. Regaining her balance, she brought her fist back up. Holding her ground, she waited for her opponent to make the first move. Yet Bekka just stood there, arms down at her sides. However, her upper body was slightly bent, her left side pointing forward, as though she was preparing to sprint. "Naw," the commentator cried. "They ain't friends. Can't be friends on the ring, yo." A spotlight painted the floor red between the two fighters, and then swept away. Bekka broke from her stance and started to stalk to the right. Stella remained in place, watching her, turning only her head. The walls of the hurricane churned, fists reaching into the ring, urging the two fighters to tangle up. A smirk touched Bekka's face, one that might have looked familiar to Stella. "Tell me if you remember this," Bekka taunted. Halting in place, she dashed toward Stella, leading with her right foot. Stomping it down, she shoved herself to the left, stomped her left foot down, and halted her movement. Then she hopped back to the right, closing her distance to Stella, whose eyes were widening. When Bekka dashed back to the left, she thrust her right fist at a downward angle in the same direction. Jumping back to the right, she pulled her arm back, jabbing the air with her elbow. At the same time, she thrust her left fist underneath her right forearm, shooting upward with her right elbow. With Bekka so close now, Stella shook herself from the strange dance and brought her fist up in defense. "Nuh-uh, girl," Bekka called. "Not like that." She was sweeping back to the left, keeping her right forearm stacked on top of the other, but swinging them in the same direction she was moving. "You know," Bekka cheered, thrusting her arms forward, both pivoting against one another, throwing her fists toward Stella's chest. Just before being struck, something clicked, and Stella knew what to do. She had to rely on reflex because of her last-minute decision. Reaching out, she snagged both of Bekka's fists and then swept them outward. Bekka's arms broke away from one another, and both fighters were about to collide with their arms spread wide. Their chests crashed into one another, and the commentator announced to the crowds, "Aye, symmetrical docking? That an attack?" Bekka and Stella ignored it all, having wrapped their arms around each other. Positioning their legs underneath them, they held on and pushed against the strength of their opponent. "Ha ha!" Bekka cheered in Stella's ear. "You got it, girl. Ain't forgot it. Right, 761? Stella gasped, the strength in her legs slipping. She was quick to catch herself, though. "Or," Bekka continued, "how about Agent Techna?" Stella pulled her arms from around Bekka and tried to push away, but Bekka held on. "Nuh-uh," Bekka laughed. "Ain't letting go now, not until you realize it's me." With another quick shove that failed to break her free, Stella demanded, "Who?" "I know I don't look it," Bekka laughed again, "but it's me, your very own Agent Dextra." Stella turned her face into Bekka's hair. "What?" Before she could finish her word, Bekka tossed her arms outward and jumped back. Stella stumbled forward, but righted herself, watching her opponent bounce from either foot, raising both her hands in victory. With each bounce, she twisted her hips from side to side. Because of how little her skirt covered, the crowds reached from the wall of the hurricane, beckoning her to come to them. Yet she wasn't even aware of their catcalls. Totally focused on Stella, she was smiling and laughing, keeping her arms raised. "Look at her, y'all," the commentator called, "like she already won or something. Ha! Ain't enough blood been spilt in my opinion." Stella looked on, captured by Bekka's emotions. It was all so familiar. Too familiar. It wasn't right. Not right at all. Finding her scowl again, she put her fist up and stalked toward her opponent. Bekka hadn't stopped bouncing from foot to foot and had yet to drop her arms in response to her opponent's approach. Stella didn't stop. Just as she reached Bekka, she flashed forward, throwing a low right jab at her opponent's defenseless abdomen. The blur of the lights couldn't keep up with Bekka's reaction. Her arms had vanished, reappearing between her and Stella. The fist that meant to strike Bekka in the stomach had met her left forearm. Another shot came at her face. Her right hand was there, snagging Stella's fist. Bekka then swept her arms outward, tossing Stella's hands away. Backing up, she then offered for Stella to close the distance. Stella brought her fist back up, but Bekka kept hers at her sides. The two stared each other down. All around them, the crowds bellowed. Since both girls had neared the edge of the ring, the fans there were reaching out for them, coming up short by a few feet. "Heh," the commentator chuckled. "They cutting eyes again. What I want to know is when is first blood, huh?" Bekka was slowly twisting her body to point her left side toward Stella. As she did so, she brought up her fists, but didn't aim them toward her opponent. Instead, she bent her left leg slightly, taking on a pose instead of a fighting stance. Stella looked her up and down, yet to break her readied posture. Her sharp eyes softened some when Bekka spoke. "I wonder, should I come at you with my salamander wing?" She laughed. Stella watched the way she laughed, squinting her eyes and tilting her head back. It could have been a generic enough mannerism, but the names spoken had triggered all the right notions. "You've seen it enough times," Bekka called, and bent her other leg, sliding that foot forward slowly. "So you know how to deal with it." Her hunched posture uncoiled, and she jabbed her right fist ahead. Lunging after it, she spread her other arm out behind her. The front of her body was facing away from Stella, catching the spotlights and blurs from above, and her opponent watched her close in. This wasn't an attack. Not at all. Bekka wasn't aiming for her opponent. Her leading fist was positioned to fly right beside Stella's head, and because the front of Bekka's body was facing outward, her back would then slide along. Stella broke from her trance and reacted the way she knew how. Twisting to her left, she spread her arms to either side just as Bekka was doing. Presenting her back to her opponents, she waited for the two to connect. When they did, the shock didn't knock her off balance. She had poised her legs to absorb the blow, which quickly became a slither. That's right. Why Maya called it the salamander wing. First came the slide, but not just along their backs. Bekka led the next part, moving her right arm along the outside of Stella's left. Their hands met, and as per the maneuver, their palms slid against one another. Then Bekka was sliding away from Stella's back. Stella focused on Bekka's left arm. It was where she expected it to be, leaving her forward arm and sliding across her back, palm facing inward. When it started to slide along her left arm, she readied her fingers. The two fighters were leaving each other, but the moment their palms met, they clamped down. Now came the final part. Following the motion Bekka began, Stella kicked one foot upward. Behind her, Bekka did the same thing. When they both kicked their other foot into the air, they were airborne. The grip they had on each other pulled them back toward one another, but before it could, they released each other's hand. Bekka felt euphoric when she twirled in the air. Coming down on one foot, her motion slowed, and she planted her other foot down, securing her balance. Several yards away, Stella had landed in the same fashion. Both fighters were facing one another again. "Hey, yo, they dancing," the commentator gasped. "They make friends or what now?" Stella had yet to bring her fist up, gazing across that blurred distance, seeing how Bekka had ended her landing. The pose was spot on. Bekka was squatting with her upper body twisted to the right, both her arms angled upward, pointing behind her. As she studied the look on Stella's face, Maya knew Stella was starting to get it. Now it was time to deal with the shock. Unwinding from her pose, she slid her right foot forward, pointing that side of her body towards Stella. Then she lifted her right fist, positioning her forearm vertically in front of her. Her left fist was held down at her hip. "Oh, she gonna unleash something," the commentator cheered. "I just know it." Bekka laughed. "I bet you know what it is, right?" She knew Stella recognized her stance. This wasn't a fighting stance, not when she did it. "Hey," she called, "let's meet up." The commentator squealed. "Calling her out, yo! What Lady Cannon gonna do?" Stella had yet to change her stance. Bekka waited, smiling. Stella's head twitched. It was so subtle, the blurs of the spotlights and noise from the crowd should have hidden it. Yet Bekka saw it. Her smile widened. Stella started forward, not raising her fists in defense. "Here she come!" the commentator cheered. "Lady Cannon coming!" Bekka didn't break her pose, not even when Stella started to trot toward her. "Closing in now!" the commentator shouted. Stella reached forward with both hands. Bekka broke her pose, doing the same thing. They gripped each other's hands, and Stella hopped, kicking both her feet forward. Bekka put all her strength into her arms, lifting Stella's hands while sliding her right foot to the side. Stella descended, sliding underneath Bekka, who dropped to both knees. With Stella's body positioned between her legs, she crashed onto her. Both wrapped their arms around the other and went rolling to the side, each trading places, being on top and bottom. Bekka was laughing the whole time. The crowd shattered the eye of the hurricane with their fists, pumping them up and down, distorting the light with their voices. "Check 'em out!" the commentator cheered. "Check 'em out!" Both girls rolled to a stop near the middle of the ring. Bekka was on top, her arms tight around Stella's head and shoulders. Their legs were intertwined. One of the spotlights paused on their location, exposing them to the crowds. "They hugging on the floor!" the commentator gasped. "What kind of show we getting tonight, eh?" Bekka was still laughing, her head caught in Stella's arms. There they were, cheek to cheek. "Agent Techna," she laughed into Stella's ear. "Operation Too Low is accomplished. Domain is dead." Gritting her teeth, Stella shouted into Bekka's ear. "You're not Agent Dextra." Bekka's arms went slack. Stella noticed and pushed with her right foot, moving the two of them into another roll. She ended it as soon as she was on top. "Trading places!" the commentator squealed. Now on her back, Bekka's arms had fallen away from Stella to lay along the floor above her head. She was laughing when she responded to Stella's accusation. "Why not?" Bekka's whole body had gone limp. Stella pulled her legs free and straddled Bekka's stomach. The crowds roared. Stella ignored them, snagging Bekka by the throat with her left hand while cocking her right fist back. "Who are you?" she demanded. Still laughing, Bekka said, "Captain Finmere sent me in. Another mission. Now I'm extracting you. Ha ha!" Hissing between her teeth, Stella plunged her right fist toward Bekka's face. Bekka's left arm flashed up from the floor and snagged Stella's fist. Stella yanked it away and tried to strike her again, but Bekka caught it with her other hand. Yanking her hand from Bekka's throat, Stella slapped that hand away and brought her fist back down. Bekka reached back in and snagged Stella's wrist. "Who are you?" Stella demanded, forgetting her left hand, and came in with her right. Bekka snagged that one too and responded with cheer. Why even worry about it? Just return to base. Mission's over. Trying to pull her wrist free, Stella asked, Did you train under Agent Dextra? Where did you come from? Bekka swept her arms outward, tossing Stella's hands to either side. Now that they were both wide open, Bekka pressed her elbows into the floor and pushed herself upright. Stella was bringing her arms back in, but Bekka was reaching underneath them. Taking Stella in a big hug, she planted her face into Stella's chest and nuzzled her cleavage. But I'm your Agent Dextra, she cheered. Did she just motorboat the great Lady Cannon, y'all? The commentator cried. If the crowds could have fallen over into the ring, they would have. All spotlights had zeroed in on the two fighters. Stella was gripping Bekka's shoulders, trying to push her off, but Bekka wouldn't let go. Snagging Bekka by the hair with her right hand, she yanked Bekka's face out of her cleavage. She then brought her left elbow up, about to crash it down onto Bekka's nose, but she stopped. Her head forced backward, Bekka was laughing up into the darkness above the spotlights. Because her expression was exposed under the reds and yellows and greens, Stella was captured by it. Not only that squinty-eyed look of glee, but the way she laughed. A goofy, drunken-sounding laugh that was impossible to replicate. Hey, hold up! The commentator called. Hold up. Pause the fight. Time out. I'm calling time out for real now. Cease fire, my lady. Stella jerked her head up and to her left. Bekka's head still forced back by Stella's grip. She opened her eyes wider and darted them about the blurred lights. Wait a minute, hold up, the commentator continued, and the jeers started sounding from the crowds. Now I know it, the commentator reassured them, but we ain't done here. Nah, we ain't nowhere near done with this. We just gonna change things up a little. Stella's grip on Bekka's hair loosened as she slowly lowered her elbow. Bekka leveled her head, saw Stella was still looking off to the right, and looked that way too. Above the crowds in that direction, the lights were too much of a blur for her to see much beyond the ring. She had somewhat of an idea how big this room was, but what she was more interested in was the commentator's location. Apparently, Stella knew. All around them, the crowds continued to jeer, but the commentator spoke over them. Something's come up, y'all. Ain't nothing gonna diminish this fight. Nah, we spicing things up. Somebody done gone and placed a bet that done changed the game. Well, I lent my ear, because I find it fascinating. Get this, y'all. Ringmaster say it legit. See, we got a tune here call himself Mr. Drone. He but a brave man, I gotta say. Y'all wanna know why? Get this. He done offer our two girls in the ring a private session backstage. No joke. What? Stella breathed. Bekka continued to listen, her arms still wrapped around Stella's upper body. The bet is, the commentator continued, that they would call off the fight and meet him back there, yo. The sound from the crowds was mixed with both boos and cheers. Bekka couldn't tell which side outweighed the other. Can y'all believe that? The commentator gasped. He gonna bet it all on whether or not they want to keep this up out here or back there. Again, the crowds were divided by either extreme of noise, but the commentator interrupted them again. I ain't even believe the ringmaster himself allow it. The crowds booed, but somewhere within their low-toned sounds came the higher pitches of cheers. But it's so, y'all, the commentator continued. So now it all come down to it. With this out of our hands, what they gonna say, huh? Lady Cannon and the new girl. What a show, eh? Bekka's vision was smeared in blurred colors as she considered the commentator's words. Then she muttered to herself, a bet? And if you ask me, the commentator added, I might can understand Mr. Drone's reasoning. While he didn't exactly specify what he meant by private session, I bet I know what going through the man's mind. I mean, come on. The way these two been acting, I say love at first sight. Both Stella and Bekka were glancing about the crowds. They were still under spotlight, but several of the other lights were raking across the energy and motion around them. Yet, Bekka could tell the hurricane's intensity had waned some. "What?" Stella spoke, drawing her attention. She was no longer shouting, despite the boos and cheers. "What is this?" "So," the commentator called, "what y'all gonna say, ladies? Was it a match made in heaven, or y'all want to slug it out some more? Make Mr. Drone cry, or make Mr. Drone lucky? Which it be?" A chant began then, from a pocket of the crowd, but it quickly spread, seizing the winds of the hurricane. "Fight! Fight! 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 Fight!" Bekka kept searching the spot where she saw Stella looking earlier. She thought she might be seeing the wall behind the crowd. It was only a half wall, though. There was a balcony of some sort above. She might have even glimpsed a set of stairs leading up. Was he over there? Was this how he... "Fight! Fight! Fight! Fight!" "Drone," she whispered. Then she beamed. "It's him." She had broken through Maya's control then, so her host fought for position, changing Bekka's face in the process. Turning her head in the opposite direction of the commentator's supposed location, she scoffed. "Hold up, girl. Don't get carried away." Bekka broke through again and turned back the other way. "But this is our chance." Maya stole control again, whipping her head back in the opposite direction. "Ain't no time to get lovesick." Stella was watching this exchange, her eyebrows rising each time Bekka's expression switched. Turning back the other way, Bekka took control again and said, "We can get out of here. Let's accept it." When her face didn't immediately switch back over, she regarded Stella with a smile she didn't recognize. Seeing as Bekka had released her, she jumped up and stepped backward. What's up with you?" she snapped. "Oh?" the commentator gasped. "Lady Cannon gonna reject the offer?" Portions of the crowds erupted with cheer as Bekka eased up onto her knees and then got to her feet. "Look," she said, looking at Stella, but addressing Maya in her head. "It's a way out." Maya didn't respond, so Bekka addressed Stella. Saying nothing at first, she extended her right hand forward. Stella looked at it and then back into Bekka's eyes. She was trying, Bekka thought, trying to find the familiar again. She had seen it already, so she was at least conflicted. With her own kind smile, Bekka offered, "I'll explain everything." "Did she just propose?" the commentator exclaimed. Once more ignoring the cheers and boos from the crowd, Stella studied Bekka and responded, "But who?" "I'm just here to get you out of here," Bekka offered, thrusting her hand closer. Stella considered Bekka's upturned palm. She was then taken back to Bekka's face when Maya took over. Scoffing, she closed the distance between Bekka and Stella. "Psh, that ain't the way we do it, right, Stella?" Stella started to back away, but Bekka reached down and snagged her right hand. Closing in, she brought Stella's hand up between them and then slapped her left hand on top of them both. "This how we do it," she said. Stella shared her gaze. The signs were there. She could see the familiar on Bekka's face again. "Yeah!" the commentator shouted. "I do believe she just proposed. Mr. Drone just might be a happy man tonight." Bekka's eyes never strayed from Stella's. The walls of the hurricane churned around them. All the spotlights were locked in, but they ignored it all. Bekka grinned. "Heck, you think I was gonna let the captain send anybody else?" Stella's hard glare didn't falter, but her shoulders relaxed. Hissing, she brought her other hand up. "Don't know what this is, but I might be interested." She slapped that hand down on top of Bekka's, and the crowds roared. "Aw, folks," the commentator announced, "I might shed a tear. What we witnessed tonight ain't gonna be forgot. And Mr. Drone, I gotta say, he ain't gonna forget either. I might even be jealous, y'all. Gonna have to ask him who ended up winning. But the way I see it, ain't not one of them gonna lose, am I right? Dark shapes cut along the floor, moving across the ring to enter the edges of the spotlights. Bekka and Stella looked, seeing the men that had formed a circle around them. Bekka recognized their shapes. They were like the men who barred her entrance to the ballroom until she was announced. "May I offer yo ladies an escort to your honeymoon suite?" the commentator called. "Don't want to get lost along the way, now do you? And don't worry, be making sure to keep the riffraff off you. Compliments of the loser of the bet." Two of the men of the circle widened the space between them and angled their arms toward the edge of the ring. Bekka looked. They were indicating the same place where she entered from. She spotted the end of the red carpet there. She had lost her bearings the moment the fight started. "Y'all be off now," the commentator said, "or else the crowd might throw a fit." Bekka took one hand away from Stella's and then led her toward the opened space in the ring of men. "I don't even believe this," Stella muttered, but Bekka didn't hear her. As they made their way down the red carpet, trying to look through all the arms and hands waving her away, she looked for him. Remembering where he had been before, only more stretched faces of the crowds were there now. The men who escorted them down the red carpet were holding their hands up to catch any rogue limbs that happened to cross the line. It was crazy, Bekka thought. The crowd could have easily overwhelmed them, as mad as many of them were, but no one stepped out of bounds. The rules. She remembered Alex saying the fans were all about the rules. Apparently so. She laughed, considered Stella's hand still clasped in hers, and she walked on. "Ain't nothing like a climax to the night," the commentator laughed. "Am I right, y'all?" The calls of the crowd followed them down the hall. Instead of the whipping winds and the crashing currents, Bekka and Stella were surrounded by the thunder. The walls rumbled with the continuing jeers. If Bekka hadn't known better, she would have thought the dissenters among the fans were crashing against the outer walls, climbing their way among the gaps in the deteriorating infrastructure and running along the floor above, trying to get ahead of them so they could jump down somewhere, cutting off their escape. The group of men escorting them never lost their composure, fixated upon their destination. She glanced back several times, hoping to catch another similar group of men escorting Mr. Drone, yet she only caught the scowl that wouldn't leave Stella's face. Maya's target hadn't said a word since they left the ring. It was smart, no questions until they were alone. Well, she figured they'd eventually be alone. She was counting on that. The men ahead of them stepped over to the left, approaching one of the doors on that side. Bekka understood it wasn't the entrance to the lounge area from before, maybe a smaller room. The other men shuffled themselves to compensate for the change in the shape of their circle, coaxing Bekka and Stella closer to the door. The man on the left turned back to them and said, "A moment, ladies, while I secure the room." Neither Bekka nor Stella said anything. That same man turned back to the door and opened it. Stepping just inside, he turned his head to scan the dim interior. Meanwhile, the other men around the two girls stood silent, unmoving. Like sentinels, Bekka thought, or automatons. A few seconds later, the one man stepped out of the room and turned to them. Nodding, he said, "You may enter." Stepping back, he offered them passage as the man opposite him pulled the door open further. Bekka tugged Stella in behind her. Once they were inside, the man who scoped the room before leaned in and said, "Mr. Drone will be with you shortly." Then the door closed, and the thunderous jeers were muted to a constant hum. Stella yanked her hand free, grabbed Bekka by the shoulders, and then shoved her against the wall just beside the door. Using both hands to hold her in place, she leaned in and questioned, "Just who are you? I want the truth now." Her arms down at her sides, Bekka wore Maya's smirk. "Even after all I said, you still don't believe me?" "How could I believe you?" Stella shot back. "Some white girl acting like she know me, impersonating someone I know." "I had to do it this way," Bekka said. "After what I pulled, I blew my cover." Stella's scowl darkened. "You mentioned domain." "Yes," Bekka replied. "What do you know of that name?" Stella asked. "Your target," Bekka answered. "Sleazeball pimp guilty of 4 murders, all women no older than 21, but they were only a few of his victims. The others are lucky enough to be alive. After what he did to them, sick monster forcing cybernetic limbs on their bodies after hacking their real ones off. Minds are all but gone, doped up to their ears to make them believe they are somewhere other than the town they were tortured in. He only gets away with it because no one knows what he looks like." "Then why?" Stella started to question, but Bekka kept going. "I knew about him, but I wasn't sent here for him." "What were you doing here then?" Stella asked. "Separate mission," Bekka answered. "Same location. Following a money trail to bust the ones responsible for the chemical explosion last month in the Bay District. You remember." Stella's grips on Bekka's shoulders loosened. Her scowl softened some. "That new stuff they called Radis." "Guys they captured were just hired thugs," Bekka continued. "Got one to spill. Outfit that hired them are tied into these underground fights. Creds they own are spent on all kinds of schemes. Might be covering their tracks through making bets. Lose on purpose to circulate the creds and then gain what they lost back by playing by the rules. But since they are so woven into this place, it's practically guaranteed their plans play out the way they want them to. A well-oiled underground industry." "And Domain is here too," Stella said, her voice calm. "Didn't intend to get involved with that," Bekka said. "Wasn't part of my mission." "That why we never ran into each other?" Stella asked. Bekka snickered. "Wondered if you even heard about me, but nah. Fenrir wanted us to be in different tiers. Cross-tier matches happened, but we never ended up facing off." "Okay," Stella said. "So, what happened then?" "Closing in on the identities of my targets," Bekka answered. "Brought me to a club just across the street by the name of Elegant Rod. Plundering the archives of these fights in one of the upper floor rooms. Disgusting setup. Part business, part dungeon. Bad timing. Dude comes in with a girl who doesn't want to be there. Starts trying to plug her up. Gonna dose her before he got started. Found out later the drips were only meant to give her heavy brain fog, but not enough that she couldn't feel what he was gonna do to her. Didn't get the chance though. Ended his streak that night. Found out who he was when I started to connect the dots. Girl was willing to talk after I got her out of there and got her sober, but I messed up. She was tagged. Something he must have slipped her. They tracked us down. Got us both out of there, but I couldn't show my face anymore. Had the info I needed to complete my job anyway." Stella's shoulders relaxed. She leaned away, but didn't let go of Bekka's shoulders. "Was hoping you heard he was dead," Bekka continued. "That way you could bail out, but you never returned to the safe house. I wanted to go back in, but Fenrir didn't want me to. Convinced him of my plan using this girl, so here I am." Stella's hands dropped from Bekka's shoulders, and she slowly backed away, looking Bekka up and down. "I heard, but didn't know who. They referred to it as a death in the family." "I knew you would," Bekka said. "Hoped to use that to convince you." "Security," Stella continued, "started to tighten up here." "Not tight enough, though," a voice boomed from across the room. They both twisted toward the sound, pinpointing it at the far right wall. It was then Bekka realized she hadn't even gotten to study this room's layout until now. The only light was another one of those portable LED sticks laying on a table, which was centered among everything. On the other side of it, positioned against the back wall, was a high-backed leather chair. The upper section of that wall was lined with tall vertical windows, but they were covered by worn-out and discolored shutters. The rest of the room looked barren, but that was because the LED stick only illuminated so much. Something moved from the shadows on the right side of the room. A new sound just barely reached their senses then, like metal whining against metal. The first thing that came to Bekka's mind was the hooks on a shower curtain running along the rod. The large figure stepped into the edges of the LED glow, and now she knew why that side of the room was so dark. The sounds she and Stella heard were what she thought they were. There was a curtain of some sort running the length of the room, acting as a partition. As soon as parts of the brute's face were captured by the low light, she recognized him. The same guy who escorted her to the ballroom. He was wearing that same wide grin from before. "Tell you what's gonna be tight," he chuckled. "Yes, sir." "Wait," Stella began, her expression darkening. "He's not the one who—" Bekka shot her hand toward the door, grabbing the knob. "Wouldn't do that, little miss," the bouncer chuckled. Bekka paused and rolled her eyes back toward him. This guy had to know more men would show up any minute now. They'd open the door to let Mr. Drone inside, and there'd be no way this mountain of a man could hide from them again. Then a thought occurred to her, one that made her loosen her grip on the door's knob. He wouldn't have to hide, would he? "Unless you want them to know what I know," he finished, confirming her fears. Keeping herself composed, she smirked, yet to pull her hand away from the knob. "This isn't part of the rules." "Heh, think that matters now?" he asked, stepping further from the partition. "What I got is worth more than any bet made this night." Maya had taken over again and rolled Bekka's eyes about, studying the room's layout once more. Bekka knew what she was doing, because she glimpsed Stella doing the same thing. Both agents were looking for alternate ways out of this room. She even wondered herself if there was a door on the other side of that curtain. Had to be how this guy got in here. "So now," the bouncer continued, ignoring their gestures, "why don't I make my own proposal?" "You only got so much time," Stella scoffed. "Yeah," the big man said, and then waved a finger at her. "But the clock's only ticking for you two. What do you prefer? That door opening, and you're totally outnumbered, and I let 'em know what you've done, thus canceling out that drone guy's bet? Or," he crossed his meaty arms along his large chest and finished, "you two use what time you have left and come out of those outfits for me." "Psh," Stella scoffed. "And then what, huh? A free show really gonna be good enough for you?" "Oh," the bouncer replied, "I'm totally gonna cop a feel. I'll get mine. Don't worry." Stella placed her hands on her hips. "For real? What, you gonna have bragging rights or something?" "Don't worry about that," the bouncer said. "You just better hurry and make your decision. I bet they're getting close with your boy." Uncurling his arms, he held his hands out to the sides. "What's it gonna be?" "Ain't no way that's gonna be it," Stella shot back. "You know too much not to run your mouth." He shrugged his shoulders. "Like I said, you don't have the luxury of worrying about all that. Quick decision, ladies." Bekka and Stella regarded one another. "Let me help you out," he added. "What I'm gonna do ain't nowhere near gonna be as bad as what they're gonna do once they find out what you did. Think about it. Quick and fun." He wiggled his fingers and then stopped. "Or slow and painful." His hands still raised, he shrugged again. "One way or another, I'm gonna get mine. I'm just trying to make it easy on you here." He really had the advantage, didn't he? Bekka thought. Once he got what he wanted, he'd slip back through that partition and out of the room without those strange men ever knowing. Maya took control then. Bekka felt all the fingers of her left hand curl inward, save for her pinky. Apparently, it was some sort of signal. because Stella noticed it with a quick flick of her eyes toward it. "So, come on, ladies," he finished. "Get the drone guy all pumped up once he steps through the door. Heh, it was gonna turn out like that anyway. Don't lie." Bekka and Stella turned to look at the big brute. His hands were still raised, and he was wiggling his fingers again, smiling big. Stella scoffed and started toward him. "Hang on," Maya said in Bekka's head. Bekka had been there at the threshold, ready to take flight if she had to, but then she relaxed, letting Maya's control settle over her completely. Ahead, Stella was nearing the large man. At the same time, she had reached up to put her thumb underneath the strip of her sports bra. With a quick flick, she pulled it down off her shoulder. Her thumb was still caught underneath, so she was stretching the material, teasing the upper portion of her left breast. The big brute's focus was right there. It was the small movement Maya needed. She dashed Bekka forward, running close to the front wall. The big guy's eyes flicked away from Stella, finding Bekka coming at him from his left. His attention averted, Stella closed in on him and jumped. Reaching up, she grabbed onto the collar of his shirt, pulling herself higher. As his head turned back in her direction, she threw a quick jab forward, striking the front of his throat. The blow sounded like a wet snap. She tossed herself away and stepped backward. The big guy brought his hands toward his neck, fingers curled as though he wanted to grab hold. His mouth hung open, his tongue protruding. He coughed, sputtered, tried to take in a breath, but he couldn't. Taking one quick step forward, he then tottered backward. Under the faint glow of the LED stick, his face was turning from red to crimson to a sickly purple. His eyes wide, he was staring at the ground. Closing his mouth, he worked his jaw back and forth, spitting drool. His eyes rolled upward and then found the door to the room. He tried to take another step forward with his other leg, but it only got so far. Holding his throat with his right hand, he reached out for the door with his left. Then he teetered forward. The upper half of his body kept going, and he was heading for the floor. At the last second, he caught himself with his left hand and landed on his knees. The collision of all that weight hitting the floor added a quick rumble to the muffled sounds outside the room. Stella let out a high-pitched moan, intending it to sound like a woman suddenly pleasured by her partner's efforts. Bekka was at her side now, watching the mountain of a man in the throes of death. She was glad Maya had control, because her knees would have been shaking. The guy dropped his right hand from his throat, pressing it to the floor to support himself. With his left hand, he tried once more to reach for the door. It was a miserable thing for Bekka to watch. He was nowhere near close enough to even brush the tips of his fingers against the door's surface. Tears were streaming down his eyes. They were rolling back in his head, so there was no way he could even see the door. Instinct was all that was left, remembering where the door was located. His hand dropped back to the floor. Both his arms bent, and the front half of his body fell. His face met the floor, and with the mounting weight coming down, his head was forced to the side. The lower half of his body was still supported by his legs. Too big and too heavy to slip out from under him, his lower half tilted to the left. Slow at first, and then he crashed upon his side with one last gurgle. Stella let out another orgasmic gasp, followed by a tantalizing moan, and the big man was no longer moving. Once silence took over the room again, Bekka was suddenly aware of the change in sound outside. Before, the boos and cheers from the crowds had been muffled, but they were no longer doing either. The hurricane had waned, but there were still so many people inside the building. Their voices continued to carry throughout. She knew why Stella made those sounds. The crowds were no longer concentrated in the ballroom. "Just to make sure," Stella spoke, startling her. Looking up from the big man, she watched Stella step over to him. She thought the agent would kneel down to check his pulse or whether he was still somehow breathing. Yet, Stella lifted one foot and swept it over the guy's head. Placing it back down, either foot was on both sides of the man's head. She then squatted down, placed one hand over his face, the other at the back of his head. Taking in a breath, she then jerked. Bekka broke through Maya's control then, flinching at the sound of breaking bone. When Stella let go of his head, it thumped against the floor. She straightened from her squat and looked back at Bekka. "Looks like I got my one kill," she said, wiping her palms against one another. Lifting one foot over the dead man's head, she stepped back over to Bekka. "So, this Mr. Drone, is he?" A knock came at the door. They both jerked their heads toward it. Saying nothing, they waited, but no one spoke from the other side. When another knock came, Bekka laid a hand on Stella's shoulder. "I got it this time," she whispered. Then she hurried over to the door. Along the way, she moved the straps of her top from her shoulders and covered the one on her right with her left hand against that arm. With her right hand, she turned the knob and pushed the door open only about an inch. Leaning against the inside threshold, she twisted herself to face into the room. Her bare shoulder was exposed, and because of the way her arms were laying across her chest and her hand covering her bra strap, it looked as though she might have been topless. Peering between the door and the threshold, she grinned and asked, "Yes?" One of those automaton men was standing just on the other side of the door. She could barely see his face, but she heard how close he was when he spoke. "We have brought Mr. Drone." Bekka bit her bottom lip and let go of the doorknob. Plunging that hand through the opening, she cooed, "Give him to me." "Here he is," the man said, his voice trailing off as he stepped back. Bekka felt the back of a person's hand meet her opened palm. She reached further, meeting the end of their sleeve, and grabbed a hold. Giggling, she pulled without trying to open the door any further. "Whoa," a man's voice grunted when he collided with it. Wait, She kept pulling, giggling the whole time. Mr. Drone was forced to open the door himself, but instead of using his hand to do so, Bekka saw a large bottle jut into the room. Mr. Drone was holding on to it with his other hand, so he used the back of his wrist to try and push the door open further. Wait, he was grunting. "Allow me," another voice said from the hallway. The door opened further, and the faint light from the LED stick still laying on the table revealed a man dressed in a hoodie. Bekka recognized it from earlier, and she didn't know if it was her eagerness or Maya's play acting that was yanking him inside now. Hold up," he was gasping, bumping his right shoulder against the edge of the door. Halfway inside, he saw her, and for a second, his struggling stopped. Then he remembered the automaton man who opened the door for him. With one quick turn of his hood to the right, he nodded to that automaton out of view. "Oh, thanks, Hurry," Bekka groaned, pulling his attention back to her. Once his arm made it around the door, he was given to her pull. Next thing he knew, he was inside, and the door closed behind him. Stella was the one who had yanked it closed. Now she was leaning against it, watching him crash into Bekka. Both stumbled further into the room until Bekka's rear met the edge of the table. The LED stick jostled along its surface. Bekka was leaning back, but holding on to the front of Mr. Drone's hoodie, folding her arms against herself to keep from falling back. Mr. Drone had to support them both with his arms stretched to either side of her. The bottoms of the bottles in each hand were anchored in place upon the table. Both Bekka and Mr. Drone were breathing into each other's face. Even with the LED stick just behind her, Bekka's head happened to be casting a shadow over the darkness underneath his hood. Mr. Drone began. "Sorry I'm late. They kept..." Bekka was smiling. With one hand, she reached up and pushed the hood off his head. Alex squinted until she retracted her hand to place it on the table next to the bottle there. Enough light reached his face now to reveal the 2 beads woven into his goatee. They kept, Alex was chuckling, wanting to give me stuff, so it was taking me a little bit to get out of. So, you do know him? Stella asked. Alex looked back at her, lifting his right hand away from the table so he could straighten himself. Bekka remained sitting on the edge, but her one hand was still latching onto the front of his hoodie. With his head turned, she spotted the 3rd bead. It was woven into the ponytail trailing from the back of his faux hawk. Offering Stella a grin, Alex said, "So you found her, huh?" Turning back to Bekka, he chuckled. Bekka bumped his chest. "You didn't tell me you were going to do that." "What?" he asked. "You mean—" "You changed your bet," she scolded. "Actually," he began, glancing back at Stella, who was stepping away from the door. Approaching them, she crossed her arms and waited for him to explain. Looking at Bekka again, he continued, "I already made the bet I told you about. Then I made that other one." Looking at Stella, he finished with, "Figured I could count on you ladies too." His eyes dropped to the space just behind her, and then his smile dropped. "Is that a dead body?" Bekka used her hand to turn his face back to her. "When were you going to tell me about the rest of your plan, Mr. Drone, sir?" Alex kept darting his eyes from her and to his right, but her hand kept him from seeing the lifeless corpse on the floor. "That's because it wasn't a part of my plan." "What plan?" Stella demanded. Again, Alex tried to regard her, but Bekka kept his head from turning. "I improvised," he offered. "Wait," Bekka began. "So you used the money you won from the first bet?" Focused on her now, Alex answered, "Yeah, well, the guy I made the bet with was so impressed he went ahead and paid up. And since I was there with the ringmaster, You bet the ringmaster?" Stella breathed. "Why is there a dead body in here?" Alex asked. "So wait," Bekka ignored his question, her smile growing. "Are you sure you and Alicia didn't fail to mention anything else to me before all this?" "Oh, great," Stella scoffed. "And who's Alicia? That another one of your personalities?" Alex looked at her, and then looked down at the dead bouncer. I think I might have missed something, actually." Bekka had allowed him to turn his head, but she kept her hand in place. It had slipped under his chin, blanketed by his goatee. The 2 beads glistened in the LED glow. When he turned back to her, she flicked her eyes up to his. "You two are all right, huh?" he asked. "I haven't decided yet," Stella scoffed, grabbing both their attentions. Maya took control then, and Bekka snatched up the bottle from the table that Alex had been holding in his right hand. Presenting it to Stella, she said with a squinty smile, "What our boy here is saying is that he's rented out a safe house for the time being." Letting go of the front of his hoodie, she then grabbed hold of Alex's goatee and yanked him closer. She leaned in and planted a kiss on him. His muted gasp was the only sound in the room. When Bekka let go of his lips, she eased away from his wide-eyed face. Still held by her grip, he blinked several times, swallowed, and then started to speak. Clearing his throat, he uttered a nervous chuckle. I don't believe we've met." The cool smile swept away from Bekka's face. She released his goatee and put that hand to her gaping mouth. Staring big-eyed at him, she then looked away and scoffed. "I can't believe you made me do that." Alex was snickering now, watching her trying to cover her embarrassed smile. Beside them, Stella was shaking her head slowly. "That is so creepy the way you do that." Alex cleared his throat again and leaned away from Bekka. Taking the other bottle from the table, he presented it and said, "Well, it's not the best atmosphere." He nodded and raised the bottle to salute the dead man on the floor, "But it is the safest place in the building." "Huh," Stella huffed, her arms still crossed. "So we're stuck here now is what you're saying." Maya's laughter was playing through Bekka's head. Her host was still present, but she could tell control had been totally given back. Remembering the bottle in her hand, she exposed the label to the LED glow. It was a brand of liquor she didn't recognize. There had been some fans of the fights who wanted to congratulate Alex on the apparent high-stakes gamble he made. She snickered under her breath. That had drawn his attention. Somehow, enough courage built itself within her, and she met his gaze. "What?" she began, and twisted the top off the bottle. "You're not gonna join the auctions with all your earnings, Mr. Drone?" "Ha!" he laughed, and immediately lowered his head. There was that bashful side of him, she thought, and put the lip of the bottle to her nose. "I think if I tried to show up at any one of those now," Alex replied, "I'd get beat up." "You know what I bet he's thinking?" Maya asked in her head. "Your boy gonna have his own private auction here." Bekka arched an eyebrow as she tipped the bottle back to get a taste of the contents. "Tell the truth," Maya continued. "How much would you strip out of that outfit for? Ha ha!" Bekka burst out laughing in mid-sip, having to pull the bottle away and wipe at her mouth. Alex had already twisted the top off the bottle he was holding and was about to take a sip, but her outburst made him pause. "What?" he asked. "What is it?" "You ain't that much of a lightweight, are you?" Stella asked, reaching over and snatching the bottle from Bekka's hand. After examining the label, her eyebrows went up. "They hooked you up, didn't they?" She tipped the bottle back and took a swallow. "Good juice, huh?" Alex asked. Stella still had the bottle tipped back. She nodded as she continued to gulp down the contents. Bekka was still wiping at her mouth and listening to Maya laughing in her head. Alex offered her the bottle he was holding. "Here, you get first sip." Taking her hand from her mouth, she reached and accepted the bottle. "How come?" Examining the label, it was the same brand as the other one. As she started to take a sip, Alex answered her. "Because I wouldn't even have it unless you agreed to my offer out there." Stella gasped when she pulled the bottle away from her mouth. Presenting it to them, she said, "Well, you two can share that one. I earned this one, since I had to agree as well." Alex chuckled. "Fair enough." She grumbled, and before she lifted the bottle to her lips, she muttered, "Don't even cover how awkward this is." Then she turned the bottle back. "Well," Bekka offered with a quick shrug, "at least we won't be disturbed, right?" Pressing the bottle to her lips, she eyeballed the dead man on the floor and then rolled her eyes back in Alex's direction. This ain't nothing," Maya told her. "I partied with fellow agents in weirder setups." Remember that the links to the previous stories in this audiobook series are available below, along with my Ko-Fi link and my website where you can find all of my printed novels and ebooks.